Assalamu alaikum. Today you will learn about object and scope in Servlet. Before moving on to any of the further topics, please be informed that this is the 15th tutorial in the series. So if you have not gone through the previous tutorials already, please go through those tutorials first and then continue with this one. So without any further ado, let's get started. If you have been following along, you must have noticed that we are using two objects a lot in our tutorial, which are request object and response object. Along with that, we also have servlet object itself, which is generated at runtime. Now the question arises, if we are using these objects and we are not creating these objects ourselves, then where are these objects getting created? Or who is creating these objects for us? Well, the answer is Tomcat container. Now, if you have been following my tutorials, in the initial couple of tutorials, I have already explained you what is Tomcat and how it handles an application. The Tomcat is the one that generates request and response object. So the way it works is, whenever a client makes a request, Tomcat generates two objects, which are request object and response object. This incoming request made by the client is stored inside request object. The request is then taken up by the servlet. Now the Tomcat also generates a servlet object at runtime. This servlet analyzes the request, does all the calculations, and sends a response inside a response object generated by the Tomcat container. The final response object is then sent back to the client in the form of an HTML page. Now you need to understand few things over here. Each time the client makes any request, new set of request and response object are generated by the Tomcat container. So if the client makes 10 requests, 10 sets of request and response object are generated by the Tomcat container. Moreover, if there are multiple clients making multiple requests, then multiple sets of request and response object will be generated by the Tomcat container. And once the response is sent back to the client, the Tomcat is responsible for destroying these objects as well. So if there are 10 clients making 2 requests each, then total 20 sets of request and response object will be generated by the Tomcat container. Once the response is sent back to the client, these objects will be destroyed by the Tomcat container as well. Now on the other hand, servlet object does not work like that. Servlet objects are not created for each request. Rather, for each client, servlets are accessed in a separate threads. So if there are 10 clients trying to access the servlet object, then the servlet will be accessed by the 10 clients in 10 separate threads. Got it? Which will save resources and memory and will increase the speed of our application. Now here I have created a very simple application. In this we are getting the parameter called name and simply printing it out on the web page. So let's run this. It says the value of attribute in request object is null. Why? Because we have not set any value. So let's set some value. Name is equals to test user. Okay. The value of name attribute in request object is test user. Right? Now what will happen if I delete this and make another request? The value is going null again. Why? This is what we have discussed just now. That for each request, new set of request and response object is created. So when the client makes another request, the previously created request and response objects are now destroyed and a new set is created. So the new object will not remember the value of the attribute. That's why it is going null again. Got it? Now what if we want our server to remember our value so that we do not have to set the value each time we make a request? How do we do that? If you remember, we have already done that in one of our previous tutorials in which we discussed about session. Yes, we can do that in the session. We discussed about session management in one of our previous tutorials. In that we discussed about multiple ways we can transfer data from one servlet to the other servlet. So similarly, here we can do that by creating a session object. How do we do that? We say http session request.getSession. And I will say session.setAttribute saved username, and I want to set this attribute when the parameter is not null. So for that I will say if username is not null and not empty, then I will set the attribute in the session. And finally here I can print it out on the web page. So I will copy this and replace this with session. For here I will say session dot, there we set the attribute, here we will get the attribute. And since it will return an object, we have to cast it into a string. right? Now save everything and run this on the server. In this we are having null value since we haven't set any value. Let's set some value. Again I will say name is equals to test user, and the value of name attribute in request and session objects both is test user. Now let's delete this and make a different request. As you can see, the request object is null because we have already discussed about this, but the session object, it is not null, rather it retained its previous value. Why is that? This, by the way, we have already covered in our initial videos, because in session we are able to set the attribute and it will be set until we change the attribute, because in session the values can be stored by calling set attribute, and we can get the attribute anytime by calling get attribute method. The application remembers the value and it retains the value in its memory in session. By the way, we have already covered this in detail in one of our previous videos, so do check it out. So no matter how many requests we make, the session object retain its value until we change the value test user 2. Notice the request object has also changed, and now if I delete this, you see the session object has updated its value to test user 2. This is because whatever the last value that you have set, it will retain its value. There is a typo over here. Let me just fix this. It should be session, right? Server has restarted, so reload. Fine. So let me now show you one interesting thing. If I set the value here, test user, and in the next request I do not set any value, the session object still store its data, right? But what if a different client is trying to access this URL? Let's see what will happen. I will go back to my Eclipse and change the browser to internal browser. So run this. Here you can see both the objects are null. So this browser represents different client. The data for one client is different and the data for different client is different. The session object here is null, while the session object here, it has some value which we have set in the previous request. Why is it not getting the same for this user as well? The answer to that is the session object retained its value for a particular client. The client for which we had set the value will retain its value. So if there are multiple clients trying to access the same URL, the value in the session object will not be same. Why? Because session object retain its value for particular user. For example, in this, if we say name is equals to user 2, and in the second request we do not pass anything, the session object will remember the previous value for this client, whereas the session object has remembered the value for this particular client. So the session object works for respective user, not for all users. But what if for some scenarios, for some extreme condition, we want our application to remember the value for each of the user? In other words, what if there is a condition in which we want to set the value and that value should be reflected for all the users or for all the clients? How we can do that? We can do that by calling servlet context. So for that we need to create an object for that. How do we do that? We can do that by calling servlet context. I will say context is equals to request dot get servlet context. The syntax is same as session. We can do context dot, or let me just copy this and replace this with context. So context dot set attribute like this, and let me just copy this from here in order to print it on the web page. I will say context dot get attribute, and let me just change this as well to context. So let's run this. As you can see, for this user all the values are null, request, session and context. Let's see for a different user. For this user also the values are null. Now what if for this user I will pass name is equals to user 1. So all the three objects have value user 1, and if I delete this, the session object retain its value, and as well as the context object also retain its value. Let's go to second user, and here I will reload this again. Here you can see request object is null, session object is null, while the context object retain its value across the user. So let's see what's going on. When the user 1 sets a value to request object, the request object only will last until first request. When we are making the second request, the request object will go empty again because that has been destroyed, while the session object retain its value because the value has been stored in the session. For the context object, the value has been stored in the context object, But the difference is in the session object, session is only applicable for this particular client or user. It will not be applicable for any other client. But in context object, the value will be applicable for all the clients in our application. So for any user that is trying to access this URL now, will get the value stored in the context object, which is user1 in this case. So let's see what we have learned today. We learned about objects that are created inside Tomcat container in a servlet application, which are request object, which is HTTP servlet request, response object provided by HTTP servlet response, and servlet object itself. These all objects are created by Tomcat container at runtime. Also, we looked into the scope of the objects that are provided by Tomcat, which is request object. The scope is for one single request. Session object, its scope is for particular user. And servlet context object, its scope is across the application. No matter how many users are there, the value is applicable for all of the user. In the next session, we shall see the objects and scope in JSP. So stay tuned.